Glenn Rhee's journey continues in part 3 of our in-depth character spotlight on The Walking Dead. What's up guys, and welcome back to another episode of Comic History, the weekly series where we go over iconic storylines and origins in the world of comics. This week we're continuing on with part 3 of our in-depth character spotlight on Glenn Rhee. If you haven't seen my character spotlights before, the point of these videos is to go through a specific character's entire run through the comics, giving context and other information about the general story along the way, but really telling the narrative of one character, and to analyze them and their place and role in the story. Part 1 of Glenn's Spotlight took him from an apparent pizza delivery boy turned supply runner in a small survivor group outside of Atlanta through the beginning of the group's life in the prison leading up to the Woodbury arcs in the first 25 issues of the comics. And Part 2 saw Glenn go through both the most horrifying and most heartwarming and meaningful moments in his entire life up to that point in issues 25 through 50. In Part 3 we're going to cover Glenn's entire run through the next 25 issues of the comics, and some huge changes and events happen here, so let's jump right in. When we left off, Glenn's fate was uncertain following the devastating attacks on the prison by Woodbury's forces. Having fled the impending battle along with his wife Maggie, their adopted child Sophia, Dale, Andrea, and their adopted children Ben and Billy. In the heat of the battle, Andrea returned with the RV and aided against the governor, but had been lost in the chaos when he ordered a Woodbury resident to ram a truck into the RV, knocking her to the ground with Michonne finding only a set of footprints in the battle's aftermath. Rick and Carl managed to escape the prison with their lives, and spend several days together, with Rick first passed out near death, and then losing his mind while hallucinating Lori calling him on a phone. They eventually come across Michonne, who has been searching for either survivors or enemies from Woodbury, and after they spend a night on the open road somewhere near Herschel's farm, they're approached by Glenn and Maggie on horseback, and Glenn has a huge grin on his face upon seeing his friends alive. When Maggie realizes that her father and brother died in the battle with Woodbury, she breaks down crying, and Glenn tries to console her, saying that they should get back to Herschel's farm where they and the others had been staying, calling back to Rick as they get on the road and telling him it's good to see him. After making it back to the farm, the group spends the night and are woken up the next morning by a gunshot fired by Andrea, with several new survivors having approached the house heavily armed with automatic weapons and a military vehicle. Before they can explain themselves, several zombies break through the shoddy fence, and Glenn dives for Abraham's gun, but Abraham puts his hand on Glenn's shoulder and says, "I got this, son," brutally killing both zombies with his knife and boots. Abraham and Eugene then make their pitch to the group, inviting them to come with them to Washington, where Eugene claims there is a government safe zone where he, as a very important scientist, can help them stop the zombie outbreak. For more information on Abraham, Eugene, and Rosita, check out our Abraham Ford character spotlight. The next day, Glenn lays with Maggie, who says that she never wants to see this place again. Glenn lowers his eyes and says that he thought she would want to stay there because of her family, and Maggie says that she doesn't have a family, and to never talk about them again. The group agrees to go with Abraham's team to Washington, with Glenn and Maggie following the vehicles on horseback. One night on the road, Rick takes over for Abraham on watch, once again speaking to his dead wife on the phone while realizing that he was losing his mind in grief. Glenn sleepily comes up to relieve Rick and take his shift, and with the phone still pressed up to his ear, Rick pauses and then tells Glenn to go back to sleep, with Glenn still half asleep and not processing what he had seen. Glenn lays back down in their tent beside Maggie, who hasn't been able to sleep since finding out about Herschel and Billy's death. Glenn asks if he can do anything, and she says to just hold her, though her eyes remain wide open. The next morning, Glenn says hey to Rick, having gotten a great night's sleep, and says that weirdly enough, he thought he saw Rick on the phone last night. Rick says, yeah, weird. The next night, Glenn leaves the campfire to go look for Maggie, who had gone off into the woods seemingly to use the bathroom, but had been gone too long. Glenn looks for Maggie and gets increasingly scared when she doesn't answer, and eventually he finds her hanging from a tree. Unable to deal with her grief, Maggie had attempted suicide. Glenn freaks out and tries to hold her body up while yelling out for somebody to help. Abraham cuts the rope and Glenn catches Maggie when she falls, begging her to be okay before realizing that she's not breathing. The group watches in silence as tears pour down Glenn's face, and when he asks what they do, Abraham says, "You know what you have to do." Glenn looks at him in horror and says that he's not going to give up, that he's going to do CPR on her, restart her heart, make her start breathing again. And Abraham grabs Glenn by the shirt collar and hauls him away, saying that he had to keep the group safe and prevent Maggie from biting anyone when she turned. Abraham whips out his machine gun and trains it on Maggie, and Glenn punches him in the face, yelling to get away from her. But Abraham punches Glenn in the gut and crumples him, once again pointing his gun at Maggie's head. Rick pulls his gun on Abraham, telling him that if he pulls his trigger, Rick will pull his. And while Abraham and Rick are arguing in the stalemate, Maggie springs up, inhaling sharply and startling the shit out of Abraham, who panics and points his gun assuming she's a zombie. And Glenn, who is still crying, yells no, she's alive. Maggie manages to say she's sorry, and Glenn keeps yelling that she's alive at Abraham, louder and more intensely each time. Glenn holds Maggie in their tent that night, and when he tries to talk to her, she says that even if she could talk about it, she doesn't want to. The next day, Glenn and Maggie have a conversation about the horses, with Maggie wanting to release them, but Glenn saying that they may need them if they run out of gas in the vehicles. Sophia begs Maggie to not leave her, and Glenn holds Maggie and reassures Sophia that they aren't going anywhere. Rick and Abraham go on an expedition to Rick's old town on the group's way to Washington, and while they're gone, Glenn confronts Maggie about the suicide attempt, with Maggie putting her arms on Glenn and saying she's okay, she's really okay, and that he doesn't have to worry. She explains the reasons for what she did and says that when she was hanging from that rope, she learned that Herschel and his religious beliefs were wrong. There's nothing on the other side waiting for her. No light, no voices, nothing. And that she just wants more time with Glenn and Sophia, who make even a life in the zombie apocalypse worth living. They kiss and are interrupted by Rick, Abraham, Carl, and a crazed Morgan, who Rick had reconnected with on the trip, all of whom had run there following a car crash caused by a massive herd of thousands of zombies, all of which had followed them in that direction. The group flees the farm they had temporarily stopped at while Rick and Abraham were gone, and resume their trip towards Washington, D.C. The group deals with hardship on the road, with Dale and Andrea's adopted son killing his brother, and Carl killing him to ensure the safety of the group, a mysterious priest showing up claiming to have survived by himself with no weapons and offering them sanctuary in his church, and Andrea noticing someone spying on her from the forest when she's using the bathroom. Glenn remains largely in the background for these issues, having one conversation with Maggie about raising Sophia and telling her that she's a good mom. When Dale mysteriously disappears, Glenn and Maggie are the only adults who don't take part in the search, being left behind to watch the kids. This is really representative of a large portion of the issues in this period of the comics. Glenn has fallen into a less prominent role in the group as new characters and storylines are being introduced and focused on. When they can't find any trace of Dale, the group reluctantly decides to go to Gabriel's church so that they can resume the search the next day. The group quickly realizes that they're being watched by people in the forest, and elsewhere a cannibal group called the Hunters devours Dale's leg while explaining their twisted survival philosophy to him. After finding out that Dale had been bitten by a zombie before they had captured him, leading to the infamous tainted meat scene, the Hunters decide to leave Dale outside of Father Gabriel's church in an attempt to scare the group into acting irrationally. Glenn and Maggie find him the next day, now missing both legs, and rush outside to see if he's alive. Rick realizes that whoever did this is using Dale as bait, and tells the group that on his signal everyone runs to the house, with Glenn and Abraham carrying Dale. They make a break for the church while Rick provides cover fire, but Glenn and Abraham can't get inside fast enough while carrying Dale, and a single shot is fired, hitting Glenn in the leg before he can get up the stairs. Rick helps him inside, and after realizing that this group was toying with them, Rick says that they're fucking with the wrong people. Eugene tends to Glenn's wounds using materials from Gabriel's church and help from Maggie, and finds that the bullet passed straight through Glenn's leg, which is lucky. Eugene cleans and seals the wound, saying that Glenn will be back to 100% in a few weeks. This bullet wound sidelines Glenn yet again as Rick, Andrea, Abraham, and Michonne hunt down the Hunters and brutally massacre them in retaliation. Eventually, the group is only a few days away from Washington and is approached by a smiling man named Aaron who asks to speak to whoever their leader is. Rick knocks the man out immediately, distrusting anyone greeting them with a smile after the governor. And when Aaron walks up, he tells them that he's a recruiter for a community of just under 40 people who live in a safe zone town protected by walls where their survivors can come live. During the conversation, the group is attacked by multiple zombies, and in the frantic battle, Glenn unties Aaron and gives him an automatic rifle to help. Aaron smiles again and gives back the gun afterwards, and when all of the group outvotes Rick, they decide to go ahead and follow him to Alexandria, seeing as for the past weeks, starvation and hunger had been their biggest enemy. Before they reach Alexandria, Rick and Abraham go with Aaron to follow a flare put up by Alexandrian supply runners in distress, again leaving Glenn behind to watch Carl. The group make it to Alexandria, which appears to be all Aaron claimed it was, and the de facto leader/community organizer Douglas interviews the survivors to help assign them to work duties, with Glenn being picked to once again become a supply runner to replace the one who was injured. The group is relieved of their weapons, which are placed inside a building Alexandria uses as an armory, and are given a tour of the town before being given 3 houses to split among their group until they can set them all up in their own houses. The group decides to instead all stay in one house for the first few nights, still unsure if they can trust the Alexandrians, ensuring that they weren't being split up for a reason. Alexandria has a Halloween night where the children can walk around and trick or treat, and Maggie tries to get Sophia to stop eating candy, to no avail. Glenn does the dishes in the house and is just happy at doing normal things again. Later on, Glenn and Maggie have a loud fight in the house over Glenn agreeing to be a supply runner again, with Maggie angry at him for putting his life in danger, and Glenn feeling responsible to help the group, doing what he's best at. Rick and Andrea hear the fight from outside, and Glenn eventually storms out and says he's sorry for that, and Rick says that it's actually refreshing, seeing as they haven't had time for normal husband and wife arguing while constantly fearing for their lives. Douglas later throws a dinner party at his home with the whole town invited, and Glenn is probably the best at socializing with the more normal Alexandrians, who haven't had to survive outside of the walls, telling stories about Tyrese's insane rampage through the zombies in the prison gym, which you can see in our Tyrese Character Spotlight. Later on in the night, Glenn is shit-faced drunk, spilling his drink on himself and stumbling and yelling, "I'm fine," with Maggie and then Rick leading him outside. Rick tells Maggie to make sure Glenn gets home and that he'll bring Sophia back in a few. Rick leaves shortly after, taking Sophia back to Glenn and Maggie's house and dropping her off with Maggie before going to the back of the house to talk to Glenn. Rick asks Glenn if he's feeling better, and Glenn grins up at him completely sober, saying that he's had a miraculous recovery. Turns out Glenn had faked his drunk outburst at the party at Rick's request, having gone straight to the armory to scout it out and figure out if their weapons were accessible. Rick tells Glenn that it doesn't matter what these people say, Alexandria is too important to let them potentially ruin, and that he wants their guns back, and Glenn is going to be the one to get them. Glenn bides his time the next day hanging out at the building where they keep the armory, pretending to look at all of the food choices until the construction crew comes to pick up their weapons for an expedition for building materials outside of the wall. Glenn says that he'd love to see inside and finds that the armory is loaded with a ton of weaponry. While Abraham and the construction crew grab their weapons, Glenn hangs to the side and stealthily unlocks one of the windows to the room. He casually leaves the building and walks right past Rick, giving him a subtle smile and thumbs up to let him know that it was a success. Rick makes his way around the block and then doubles back to the yard outside the armory, opening the window and being startled when Glenn comes up and says, "Hey!" Then climbing into the window and grabbing few enough guns to hopefully go unnoticed, and loading them into a book bag, heading out of the backyard while Rick goes around the front. Rick and Glenn meet up at Glenn's house, taking inventory of what he got and deciding to distribute them to key members in each house, keeping it a secret from the others in their group, just in case they ever had people take Alexandria's side against them in any potential conflict. Shortly after this, Glenn and Heath, Alexandria's uninjured supply runner, prepare for Glenn's first run into DC to look for medicine for Scott, his injured predecessor, along with whatever else they can bring back. They grab a pistol each, and when they leave the armory, Glenn finds Maggie and Sophia waiting to send him off. Glenn says that Maggie had earlier said no goodbyes, but she hugs him and says that she just had to see him, and Glenn says not to worry, that nothing could keep him from coming home to her and Sophia. As they leave, Heath says Glenn shouldn't make promises he doesn't know he can keep, and Glenn says he doesn't. Glenn and Heath make it to the outskirts of the city, planning to take Heath's usual route over the rooftops into a pharmacy building, and if they don't find what they need there, to check a few apartment buildings nearby. Glenn smiles and says lead the way, but watching Heath swing from a rope to a fire escape, his eyes widen. He takes the rope, steadies himself, and then swings over, slamming roughly into the fire escape and dropping the rope. Heath helps him over the railing and Glenn pants, saying no sweat. They leap across rooftops and Glenn says he's warming back up to this, telling Heath that he had done this a lot around Atlanta, and as the buildings get further apart, they go to an alley Heath says is usually clear, finding it completely filled with zombies. They remain on the rooftop until nightfall, waiting to see if the zombies moved on, but they can still hear the moaning from the alleyway. Glenn notes how weird it is that they're all grouped up right there, and Heath says that something definitely must have their attention. The next morning, Heath wakes up to Glenn looking over the side of the building, having found out what had led the zombies there was a survivor group locked in one of the buildings. Heath says they need to get their things and go while they have the zombies distracted, but Glenn says that he's more worried about these people seeing them than the zombies, having experienced what people can be like during the Governor arcs, which I covered in part 2 of this spotlight. On the ground, the people in the store push one of their own members out into the massive zombie horde, saying that it's the only way and that they've been trapped in that store for almost a week. The man is brutally ripped apart by the horde, and Glenn and Heath watch as his screams are replaced by the zombies' groans. Heath is shocked that they pushed him, and Glenn says they need to go to the pharmacy while they still can. They manage to find 6 out of the 10 things on their list, and Glenn says he wants to make it back to Alexandria before nightfall. As he talks, a zombie walks up behind him and Heath suddenly pulls his gun, with Glenn thinking it was to shoot him, as Heath instead kills the zombie and saves his life. And that is where we're going to wrap up part 3 of our in-depth character spotlight on Glenn Rhee from The Walking Dead. At this point in the story, Glenn is definitely still around. He has a number of great moments, from the conflict with Abraham during Maggie's suicide attempt, to his return to form and usefulness again in Alexandria. What we get here from Glenn is all great, but the fact is there are a ton of issues where Glenn doesn't even appear, or in many barely appears at all. The natural progression of The Walking Dead through the levels of society rebuilding involves constantly expanding the characters, storylines, and events we're witnessing, introducing entirely new plot lines, locales, characters, and stories to explore. As a side effect, a character like Glenn, who has been around since damn near day one and has been a major character thus far, kinda gets put in the background in many situations, barely impacting any of the major conflicts the group has with others like the Marauders, the Hunters, and the trip into Alexandria. Instead, Glenn's storyline during this time focuses on character interaction with Maggie, a continued loyalty to Rick, and eventually a return to form as an incredibly useful, skilled member of the group during their time in Alexandria, using his stealth skills to reacquire their guns and being a skilled supply runner for the town. This video covered Glenn in the comics from issue 51 through 75, and Glenn's journey will continue in the fourth and final part to this spotlight, where we'll round out Glenn's run through issue 76 through 100, including his brutal death at the hands of Negan. At the end of part 4, I will also be announcing which character is getting an in-depth character spotlight next, so if you enjoyed this video or learned something new about the comics, make sure to leave me a comment, hit the thumbs up button, and subscribe to my channel. Interacting with my videos and sharing them around is the best way to help them reach more people, which can ensure that I can keep making them. These character spotlights were something I received an amazing response to, and I want to make them a regular edition of comic history, so expect more great Walking Dead, DC, Marvel, and all sorts of other content in the future. Check out the character spotlight episodes we've done so far, check out the comic history playlist for all of the episodes, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, you can donate to our Patreon at patreon.com/rnsentertainment. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I will see you all next time.